The grease was already popping before the screen door slammed shut. You could hear it from the front room: cast iron heating, butter browning, something from the garden about to disappear into a dish that fed the whole family twice. Here are 30 forgotten hillbilly casseroles that defined country life in the 1970s. Yellow squash casserole showed up the moment the garden started producing faster than anyone could eat. You sliced it thin, no thicker than a nickel, because that was how the old women did it, and nobody argued with results. The squash went into a skillet with butter and sweet onion, cooked down just enough to lose its raw bite, but not so long it turned to mush. And knowing when to pull it off the heat was something you learned by standing at the stove, not from any book. The filling got folded with sour cream and cream of chicken soup, then buried under crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter. That cracker crust came out golden and shattered when you pressed a spoon through it. Every church supper in the rural South had at least two on the table by the 1970s, and the women who brought them knew whose was better without anyone saying a word. Most people overcook the squash now or skip the crackers entirely, and what comes out of the oven is close, but never the same. Scalloped corn came together in a mixing bowl with the kind of ingredients that never needed a recipe card. Whole kernel corn drained and saved, cream-style corn from the can, eggs cracked in one-handed evaporated milk, and a sleeve of saltine crackers crushed by fist inside the bag. In parts of Ohio and the rural Midwest, Swiss cheese got folded in, a tradition that likely came from the Amish communities who sold their cheese at local markets for almost nothing. The casserole baked at 325 until it set like a custard in the center and turned golden at the edges. You tested it the same way you tested cornbread, a bump of the pan, watching to see if the middle still shook. Your grandmother made this for Thanksgiving and Christmas without fail, and the dish came to the table in the same ceramic baking pan every single year. She never wrote the recipe down because she never needed to. After she was gone, 3 different cousins tried to make it from memory. None of them got it right. Hash brown funeral potatoes earned their name the hard way. They showed up after someone died. The recipe started in Mormon communities in Utah, where it was a fixture at post-funeral luncheons, but by the middle of the 1970s, it had spread through church basements and potluck tables across the rural South and Midwest. The whole thing was built from frozen shredded hash browns, sour cream, a can of cream of chicken soup, a heavy pour of shredded cheddar, and a topping of crushed cornflakes fried in melted butter until they crisped into something almost candy-like. What walked into the kitchen as a bag of frozen potatoes and a stack of canned goods walked out of the oven as something rich and golden and deeply comforting. The kind of dish that could make a grieving family sit down and eat when nothing else could. The cornflake crust was the secret. Without it, you just had cheesy potatoes. With it, you had the dish that said somebody cared enough to bring their best to your worst day. Cabbage roll casserole was what happened when a woman loved the flavor of stuffed cabbage but had 4 kids to feed and no time to roll anything. The original stuffed cabbage came from Eastern European immigrants, Polish, Czech, Hungarian families who settled across Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley to work the mines and the mills. Their wives rolled seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage leaves and simmered them in tomato sauce for hours. The casserole version took the same ingredients: ground beef, chopped cabbage, rice, condensed tomato soup, and a pour of beef broth, and layered them raw in a baking dish. It went into the oven for 90 minutes and came out tasting like somebody had been cooking all day. You never told company it only took 15 minutes to assemble. That was the unspoken rule of country casserole cooking. The less effort it looked like, the more it impressed, and nobody ever asked how you pulled it off. If cabbage rolls taught you how to stretch a meal, 7-layer casserole taught you how to stretch a prayer. The whole trick was that the rice went in raw, uncooked, straight from the box, and the liquid from the tomato sauce and the fat from the bacon on top cooked it in the baking dish. You layered it in order, and you did not skip a step. Rice on the bottom, then ground beef crumbled raw, then tomato sauce, then onion rings, then bell pepper rings, then celery, then strips of raw bacon draped across the top like a blanket. Covered tight with foil, it baked for 2 hours, and the whole house filled with a smell that brought the kids in from the yard without being called. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks all through the 1960s and 70s, always handwritten, always from someone named Dorothy or Mildred. It cost almost nothing. It fed almost everyone. She kept the canned salmon on the second shelf behind the pinto beans, and she only brought it down on Fridays. Salmon patty casserole was a Friday night staple in country homes where the pantry did more work than the icebox. The canned salmon, bones, skin, and all, got mashed with cracker crumbs, an egg, and a little grated onion, then pressed into a greased baking dish instead of shaped into patties. A can of cream of celery soup thinned with a splash of milk went over the top, and the whole thing baked until it bubbled and firmed up enough to slice. Some women laid sliced boiled eggs across the middle before pouring the soup over, a trick that made the casserole look planned instead of pulled together from what was on the shelf. The woman who taught you this is probably gone now. The canned salmon is still at the store, but nobody reaches for it the way she did, quick and sure, like she already knew what supper was before she opened the pantry door. Cornbread dressing casserole started the day before, always the day before, because the cornbread had to go stale. You baked a full skillet of buttermilk cornbread, crumbled it by hand into a bowl the size of a wash tub, and let it sit on the counter overnight with a towel draped across the top. The next morning came the sage, rubbed sage, never ground because ground sage turned bitter and only someone who had never made dressing would use it. The broth came from giblets, and the neck simmered low with onion and celery until the kitchen smelled like Thanksgiving, even if it was just a Tuesday. Eggs bound it, and the whole thing went into a cast iron skillet greased with bacon drippings. It baked until the top went crisp and dark while the center stayed soft and almost custard-like. Every family had their own version, and every family believed theirs was the only right one. When the woman who made it passed, Thanksgiving lost something the recipe card could never give back. In the weeks after deer season, the freezer was full and the kitchen adjusted accordingly. Ground venison and potato casserole was a hunter's wife's invention, a way to turn a freezer bag of dark, lean game meat into something the whole family would eat without complaint. The venison got browned in a cast iron skillet with a generous pour of bacon grease because venison on its own was too lean and would dry out in the oven without borrowed fat. That was the trick nobody wrote down about cooking wild game. It needed the fat from something else to carry it. Sliced potatoes went in the bottom of the dish, then the browned venison, then cream of mushroom soup, then another layer of potatoes, and cheddar cheese melted across the top. In Appalachian communities from West Virginia to eastern Kentucky, this casserole showed up on weeknight tables all through the 1970s. It tasted like the woods and the wood stove and the pride of a family that fed itself from its own land. Before there were freezers, before there were pressure canners, there were shucky beans, green beans strung on thread with a needle and hung from porch rafters until they dried into something that looked like shriveled leather and smelled like the memory of summer. The Cherokee are often credited with teaching settlers the practice, though German immigrants from the Palatinate brought a near-identical tradition called Get-Rocknet Bohnen, and somewhere in the mountains the two methods became one. To make the casserole, you soaked the dried beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a chunk of fat back until they turned silky and rich, deeper than fresh green beans, almost tannic, tasting of smoke and thyme and the barn roof where they dried in August heat. A cornbread batter poured over the top and baked until golden turned it into a one-dish meal. What started as a way to survive winter became the dish families requested at every holiday. If you knew what a cushaw was, you were from the mountains, and that was all anyone needed to know about you. The cushaw squash was a massive, striped, green and white gourd that could grow to 30 pounds or more on a single vine running wild through the garden. Mark Sohn documented it as one of the signature vegetables of Appalachian home cooking, a food so tied to the region that most people outside the mountains had never seen one. You split it with a hatchet because no kitchen knife was big enough, scooped the seeds, and baked the flesh until it turned soft and sweet as pumpkin, but lighter, smoother on the tongue. The casserole version mashed it with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and a little vanilla, then baked it in a dish until the top caramelized and the edges darkened to amber. Old-timers saved the seeds every year, passing them to neighbors, keeping the strain alive. When the last person who saved those seeds stopped planting, something older than any recipe disappeared with them. The kitchens that grew cushaw in the garden often kept a crock of sauerkraut in the cellar, and what came out of that crock fed families through winters that started early and ended late. Kraut and Wiener casserole was German Appalachian cooking at its most practical, a dish built from two things that kept almost forever and cost next to nothing. The sauerkraut came from a stoneware crock where cabbage had been salted and pressed and left to ferment for weeks in the root cellar, and the wieners were the cheapest protein at the general store. You layered them in a baking dish with caraway seeds, a little brown sugar to cut the sourness, and sometimes sliced potatoes if the family was large and the wieners were few. It showed up in every holler and every coal camp kitchen from eastern Kentucky to southern West Virginia. It smelled sharp and sour, and it tasted like the kind of meal that got you through February. Pinto bean and cornbread bake was not a recipe anyone invented. It was a combination so old and so natural that it felt like it had always existed, the way rain exists or hunger. Soup beans, what the mountain people called pintos, simmered low with salt pork or a ham hock, were the foundation of Appalachian cooking, the one dish that appeared on the table more than any other. The casserole version ladled those slow-cooked beans into a deep baking dish and poured cornbread batter directly over the top, so the bread baked on the surface and soaked up the broth from below. The bottom of the cornbread turned dark and soft and almost like a dumpling, while the top crisped into a golden crust that cracked when you cut through it. A raw onion sliced thick went on the side, and nothing else was needed. In the mountains, that was not poverty. That was supper, and it was enough. You could always tell hog killing day was close when the crackling jar came out. Crackling cornbread casserole was built around the crisp, rendered pieces of pork skin and fat left over after the lard had been cooked down in a washpot over an open fire, a process that turned a whole hog into months of cooking fat and left behind golden, crunchy bits that tasted like salt and smoke and everything good about fall in the country. The cracklings got folded into a thick cornmeal batter made with buttermilk and a little baking soda, then poured into a cast-iron skillet already hot with grease and baked until the edges pulled away from the pan. In a casserole dish, the batter went deeper and the cracklings sank to the middle, creating pockets of rich, salty fat inside the bread that you hit unexpectedly with every other bite. You either grew up eating this, or you had no idea it existed. There was no middle ground. The tomatoes had to be dead ripe, soft enough that juice ran down your arm when you sliced them, warm from the vine, smelling like summer itself. Tomato pie casserole was a dish that only existed for about 6 weeks every year because it demanded garden tomatoes and nothing from a can would do. You sliced them thick, layered them in a baking dish with salt, pepper, and torn basil leaves, then spread a mixture of mayonnaise and sharp cheddar cheese across the top and baked it until the cheese went golden and the tomatoes collapsed into a sweet, bubbling mess underneath. Some added a bottom crust of leftover biscuit dough. Others crumbled saltines between the layers. In the rural South, this showed up at every summer potluck and disappeared first from the table. Your mother made it every August, and the kitchen smelled like warm tomatoes and melted cheese for the rest of the afternoon. She is gone now, and August does not smell like that anymore. If tomato pie belonged to summer, hominy casserole belonged to the cold months when the pantry shrank and the meals got simpler. Hominy, dried corn kernels soaked in lye water until the hulls slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size, was one of the oldest foods on the continent, a technique inherited from indigenous peoples long before European settlers arrived in the mountains. By the 1970s, most country cooks were using canned hominy from the store, but the older women still remembered making it from scratch in the yard with hardwood ash water and a sense of timing that no clock could teach. The casserole drained the hominy, mixed it with browned sausage, cheddar cheese, and a little cream, then baked it until it set firm and the cheese browned on top. The corn had a chewy, almost meaty texture that confused people who had never eaten it. You either knew hominy or you did not, and country kids always knew. Nobody under 40 knows what poke salad is anymore, and that is exactly why this belongs here. Poke was a wild green, pokeweed, growing along fence rows and at the edges of fields. That was free for the picking every spring, but it came with a catch. The leaves were toxic if you did not boil them at least twice, sometimes 3 times, pouring off the water each time to leach the poison out. Only the young, tender shoots were safe, and you had to pick them before the stems turned red. The blanched greens got drained hard, chopped, and mixed with scrambled eggs, bacon grease, and a little onion, then baked in a casserole dish until the eggs set and the top went firm. It tasted green and earthy and a little bitter, like the woods themselves had sent something to the table. The old women picked it every April without a field guide or a worry. They knew which plants were safe the way they knew which clouds meant rain, by living close enough to notice. Every spring in the mountains of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, the ramp suppers started, and the smell could clear a room or draw a crowd depending on who you asked. Ramps are wild leeks that grow in shaded hollows under hardwood canopy, and their flavor sits somewhere between garlic and onion with a sharpness that stays on your breath for days. Ramp festivals drew entire communities, churches, fire departments, civic clubs, all cooking ramps scrambled with eggs, fried with potatoes, or baked into casseroles with cheese and cream. The casserole version layered chopped ramps with beaten eggs, shredded cheddar, and a pour of cream, then baked it low and slow until it puffed up like a soufflé and sank when it cooled. Kids who grew up eating ramps every spring carried that taste with them for the rest of their lives. Some still drive hours into the mountains every April, looking for the patch their grandmother showed them, hoping the ramps are still there, even if she is not. The worst part of blackberry picking was not the thorns or the heat or the chiggers. It was knowing your grandmother would inspect the bucket and send you back out if it was not full enough. Blackberry dumpling casserole was the reward for an afternoon of bleeding arms and sweat-soaked shirts, and every kid who picked wild berries along a fence row in July knew what that reward tasted like. The berries went into a cast-iron skillet with sugar and a little water, cooked until they burst and thickened, and then biscuit dough got torn into rough pieces and dropped right into the bubbling fruit. A lid went on, and you did not touch it. You waited. The dumplings steamed inside the berry juice until they turned soft on the bottom and just barely set on top. The whole thing got served warm with cold cream poured over. She made it every summer, and when she stopped making it, summer tasted different for good. You had to wait for the frost. That was the first rule, and the only one that mattered. Wild persimmons picked before the first hard freeze would pucker your mouth shut, so astringent they were nearly inedible, and that bitterness was nature's way of saying, be patient. After the frost, the small orange fruits turned soft and sweet, almost honey-like, and country women gathered them in aprons and flour sacks and worked the pulp through a colander by hand. The casserole mixed persimmon pulp with eggs, buttermilk, sugar, cinnamon, and a little flour, then baked it until it set into something between a pudding and a custard, dense and dark and fragrant, with a sweetness that came from the tree and the cold and the waiting. Heavy cream went over the top, still cold from the icebox. The women who knew where the best persimmon trees grew guarded those spots like secrets. When they passed, the trees still fruited every fall, but nobody came to pick them. If persimmon pudding was patience rewarded, turnip green casserole was hardship made into something worth sitting down for. Turnip greens were poor people food, the leafy tops of a root vegetable that most families grew because turnips stored well in a root cellar through winter and the greens could be cut again and again. The greens got boiled with a ham hock or a piece of salt pork until they went dark and tender, and the cooking liquid, pot liquor they called it, was saved because it held every mineral and every bit of flavor the greens had given up. The casserole layered the drained greens with cornmeal batter and a pour of that pot liquor, then baked until the cornmeal set and the greens melted into the bread. It was bitter and rich and sustaining in a way that store-bought food never managed. The last time it tasted right was the last time your mother's mother made it in that iron pan with the handle wrapped in a dishcloth because the wood grip broke off years ago. In the 1970s, sweet potato casserole split into two camps, and every family picked a side. One camp topped it with marshmallows, a practice that traced back to a 1917 recipe booklet from the Angelus Marshmallow Company, which had pushed the combination as modern and convenient. The other camp used sorghum molasses and crushed pecans, and those were the mountain families who had been sweetening with sorghum since before white sugar was affordable. The sweet potatoes came from the garden, baked in the ashes of the wood stove or the oven, then mashed with butter and spices and spread into a dish. The sorghum version had a darker, more complex sweetness, almost smoky, with a slight bitterness that cut through the richness of the potato. You did not measure the sorghum. You poured until the color looked right. That casserole carried a family's whole history in one dish: what they grew, what they could afford, and who taught them that sorghum was sweeter than sugar if you knew how to use it. She called them slick runners, and if you called them anything else, she would correct you without looking up from the dough. Chicken and slick dumpling casserole was mountain cooking at its most specific. The dumplings were not the fluffy drop biscuit kind that most of the country knew. They were rolled flat on a floured board, cut into strips, and slid into simmering chicken broth where they turned silky and almost translucent, with a texture like the softest noodle you ever tasted. Mark Sohn documented them as a signature Appalachian technique, distinct from any other dumpling tradition in the South. The casserole version layered the cooked slick dumplings with shredded chicken, and the broth they cooked in thickened with a little flour and butter, then baked until the top dumplings crisped at the edges. The woman who made these right rolled the dough so thin you could almost see through it. Her hands knew the thickness by feel. Nobody who learned from a recipe ever got them that thin. Dried apple stack cake was not a cake anyone baked alone. It was a cake a whole community built together. In the Appalachian Mountains, where sugar was scarce and butter was saved for biscuits, this cake showed up at weddings, and each guest brought a single thin layer as their gift. The layers were made from a stiff molasses dough, barely sweet, rolled thin and baked crisp in a cast-iron skillet. Between each layer went a filling of dried apples simmered back to life with a little sugar and spice. The finished cake sat for 2 or 3 days before anyone cut it, letting the moisture from the apples soak into the dry layers and soften them into something dense and fragrant. The more layers it had, the more people had come to celebrate. The casserole version layered dough and apple filling in a deep dish, the same flavors with less ceremony, but no less love. The tradition faded as white sugar got cheap and box cake mixes filled the shelves, but the women who remembered it talked about it the way other people talk about cathedrals. The rabbit came from the yard or the fence row, not from a store, and the man who brought it in had it cleaned and quartered before the kitchen even knew supper had been decided. Rabbit and root vegetable casserole was a cold-weather dish in country homes where hunting was not sport, but grocery shopping with a different set of tools. The rabbit got browned in bacon grease, then laid over a bed of carrots, potatoes, and onions pulled from the root cellar. A splash of water or broth, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf went in before the dish got sealed tight with foil and baked low for 2 hours until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. Biscuit dough pressed over the top during the last 30 minutes gave it a golden lid that soaked up the drippings and turned flaky on the surface. Families who ate rabbit never talked about it like it was unusual. It was just Tuesday. The generation that stopped hunting was the generation that stopped making this dish, and the root cellar went empty around the same time. The root cellar held the potatoes and the onions, but it was the bag of dried pintos on the pantry shelf that held the family together when nothing else could. Soup bean casserole was the dish that showed up when the money ran out before the month did. Pinto beans simmered all day with a ham hock until the broth turned thick and smoky, then baked in a deep dish with sliced onion and a crust of cornbread on top. It was the meal your grandmother made when she had already stretched everything else as far as it would go. She served it without apology and without explanation, and you ate it without asking why there was nothing else on the table, because even as a child you understood that some questions were not yours to ask. She is gone now, and the kitchen where she made it has been quiet for years. You have tried to make it yourself, measuring the beans, timing the simmer, salting the broth, It comes out close. It never comes out right. Broccoli and Velveeta rice casserole was the dish that proved country cooking could absorb anything the modern grocery store threw at it and still come out tasting like home. By the 1970s, Velveeta had reached every general store and small-town market in rural America, and women who had cooked with lard and cornmeal their whole lives discovered that the processed cheese melted smoother than anything they had ever used. Frozen broccoli, cream of mushroom soup, minute rice, and a half block of Velveeta, layered and baked until bubbling, became the casserole that showed up at every church potluck, every funeral dinner, every covered dish supper from the hollers of Kentucky to the flatlands of southern Ohio. It was the first casserole a young bride learned to make, taught by her mother-in-law in someone else's kitchen with someone else's measuring cups. That kitchen is closed now. The Velveeta is still on the shelf, but the hands that taught her are still. The bread had to be stale. That was the whole point. Scalloped tomatoes existed because country women refused to throw away bread that had gone hard, and they turned that stubbornness into something beautiful. Torn pieces of day-old white bread or leftover biscuits went into a buttered baking dish, layered with canned tomatoes from the summer's put-up, dots of butter, a spoonful of sugar to cut the acid, salt, and pepper. It baked until the bread soaked through with tomato juice and the top pieces crisped into something halfway between toast and pudding. The dish had roots in Depression-era kitchens where waste was a sin worse than anything the preacher mentioned, and it survived into the 1970s on the strength of its simplicity alone. You could taste the summer garden in every bite, even in January. The woman who canned those tomatoes labeled every jar with the date in her own handwriting. The last jar sat on the shelf for 3 years after she passed. Nobody could bring themselves to open it. Nothing was wasted in a country kitchen, and bread pudding casserole was the proof. Stale biscuits, leftover cornbread, heels of sandwich loaves, everything that had gone dry and hard got torn into pieces, soaked in a custard of eggs, milk, and sorghum syrup, and baked until the top puffed golden and the center set into something rich and trembling. A little vanilla if you had it, a handful of raisins if you did not, and a pour of warm sorghum over each serving that pooled in the cracks and turned every bite into something that tasted like the kitchen itself, warm and sweet and too small for all the people who needed to be in it. The sorghum was the Appalachian sweetener, darker and more complex than white sugar, cooked from cane at neighborhood stir-offs that were as much about fellowship as they were about syrup. This casserole was a grandmother's way of saying that nothing is worthless if the right hands touch it. When she died, the biscuits stopped being saved. You could hear her cutting the corn off the cob before you even walked into the kitchen. The blade scraping down, the kernels hitting the bowl like rain on a tin roof. Fried corn and bacon casserole started with ears of sweet corn sliced close to the cob, then scraped again with the back of the knife to get the milk out. That starchy, sweet liquid that gave the dish its cream without a drop of dairy. Bacon went in first, rendered until crisp, and the corn cooked in the drippings with a little butter and salt until it thickened into something halfway between a vegetable and a pudding. Poured into a baking dish and finished in the oven, it browned on top and stayed soft underneath. Only fresh corn worked. Canned corn did not have the milk. Frozen corn did not have the sugar. She grew her own. Silver Queen or Bodacious, planted by the fence where the sun hit longest. The garden is overgrown now. The corn rows are gone. And that sound, the blade on the cob, the kernels falling, is the sound you miss most. The skillet was the last thing she would have given away, and the first thing her kids argued about after she was gone. Cast iron skillet cornbread casserole was not a recipe. It was a relationship between a woman and a pan seasoned by decades of bacon grease and heat until it was blacker than coal and smoother than glass. The cornbread went in as batter, buttermilk, cornmeal, an egg, a pinch of soda, and no sugar, because real Southern cornbread never had sugar, and she would tell you so if you asked. The skillet had to be smoking hot with a spoonful of grease before the batter hit the iron, and the sizzle when it landed was the sound that meant supper was almost ready. The bottom crust came out dark and crisp, and the inside stayed tender and steaming, and you ate it with beans or greens or crumbled into buttermilk. That skillet is in someone's cabinet now, maybe still seasoned, maybe not. The cornbread it made cannot be duplicated in any other pan. The pan remembers her. Nothing else cooks the same. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Making gravy from pan drippings was the technique that turned every meat dish into 2 meals and wasted nothing in kitchens where every calorie counted towards survival. After frying or roasting meat, the browned bits and rendered fat left in the pan became foundation for rich gravies that stretched protein into something more filling. Flour was sprinkled directly into hot fat and stirred constantly until it formed a paste that cooked to golden brown, developing deep, nutty flavors. Milk, water, or broth was added slowly while stirring to prevent lumps, creating smooth gravy that captured every bit of flavor from the original meat. Children learned to make gravy by standing beside mothers at the stove, learning exact motions and timing that defined good cooking. The gravy was poured over biscuits, potatoes, and cornbread, making small amounts of meat feed large families. Nothing was scraped into garbage when this knowledge lived in households. Pinning a slice of bread to the cut side of a cake with toothpicks to keep it moist was the kind of trick that made you laugh until you tried it and watched it work. When you sliced into a cake and left the exposed crumb open to air, moisture evaporated fast and the edges turned dry and crumbly by the next morning. But a piece of white bread pressed flat against the cut surface with 2 toothpicks acted like a seal. The bread dried out instead of the cake, sacrificing itself so the good part stayed soft. You peeled the stale bread off the next day, and the cake underneath was as fresh as the hour it came out of the oven. This trick showed up at church socials and county fairs across Appalachia, wherever a woman needed a cake to last through a long afternoon of serving. It cost 1 slice of bread and solved a problem that aluminum foil and plastic wrap never quite fixed. Fried salt pork with gravy was the kind of meal that stuck to your bones and made you thankful for every bite. Salt pork was cheap and cured, tough until you fried it just right in a black skillet. Once it crisped, the leftover drippings turned into gold, stirred with flour and milk to make creamy white gravy that poured like silk. It covered biscuits, potatoes, or anything else that needed saving from plainness. For mountain folks, this dish turned poverty into pleasure. It filled bellies after long days in the fields and made Sunday mornings smell like grace. Salt pork was often the only meat on the table, but with that gravy, no one minded. The taste was bold, smoky, and honest, like the people who made it. A plate of fried salt pork reminded everyone that ingenuity could feed a family when the cupboard said otherwise. It was poor man's steak with rich man's flavor. Soaking beans with baking soda was a trick that solved 2 problems at once in mountain kitchens where fuel was precious and time was always scarce for busy families. A pinch of baking soda added to soaking water softened dried beans faster by breaking down their tough outer skins, reducing cooking time by hours. For families burning wood they had chopped themselves, shorter cooking times meant real savings in labor and resources. The alkaline water also neutralized compounds that caused digestive discomfort, making beans easier on stomachs. Women learned exact amounts through trial and error, knowing too much soda left a soapy taste while too little made no difference. The beans soaked overnight in crocks near the warm stove, absorbing water and releasing starches. By morning, they were plump and ready, cooking to creamy softness in half the usual time. This knowledge passed quietly between neighbors as practical wisdom that made survival easier. If saving grease was the first rule of those kitchens, preheating the cast iron skillet before pouring cornbread batter was the second, and breaking it meant soggy, pale bread that embarrassed whoever made it. You set the skillet in the oven while it heated, dropped a tablespoon of bacon grease into the hot pan, swirled it until the sides were coated, and poured in the batter fast. That searing contact between cold batter and screaming hot iron created the golden crust that crackled when you broke a piece off. The crust that separated real cornbread from the sweet, cakey version people in the mountains refused to eat. Appalachian cornbread had 3 rules: all cornmeal, buttermilk, and absolutely no sugar, and the hot skillet was the 4th. You learned it by hearing that hard sizzle when the batter hit the grease, and knowing the bread was going to be right. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride. A way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Wrapping food in wet newspaper before burying it in coals was a technique that created steam cooking without any equipment at all beyond what most families had available. The dampened paper protected food from direct contact with ash, while moisture trapped inside created pressure that cooked fish and vegetables evenly throughout. Mountain families learned this from Native American traditions and adapted it to their own needs, using whatever paper was available from rare newspapers to catalog pages. The paper charred on the outside while food inside steamed to perfection, emerging clean and thoroughly cooked. Timing was crucial because too long meant paper burned through while too short left food underdone. Experienced cooks developed instinct for judging coals and thickness. The technique worked especially well for delicate fish that fell apart when fried, keeping flesh intact while infusing subtle smoke flavor. Children watched this magic happen at fish fries. Soaking wild game in buttermilk overnight was the hunter's trick that every mountain family knew and most modern cooks have never heard of. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, anything that came out of the woods with that sharp, iron-heavy flavor got dropped into a bowl of buttermilk and left in the cold overnight or sometimes 2 full days. The lactic acid broke down the tough muscle fibers gently without turning the meat to mush the way vinegar sometimes did, and the calcium triggered enzymes that softened the protein from the inside. What came out the next morning was tender, mild, and ready to flour and fry without any gamey bite. The old women never talked about enzymes. They said the buttermilk pulled the wild out of it, and that was explanation enough. You rinsed it, patted it dry, and seasoned it. Nobody at the table ever knew it had been running through the hollow 2 days before. Cornbread and milk supper was what families ate when the pantry was nearly bare. A leftover wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, covered with cold milk or tangy buttermilk, became dinner without complaint. It was cool and soft, with just enough salt and sweetness to feel like comfort. Hill folk did not see this as poor eating. They saw it as good sense. Every crumb mattered. Every drop of milk earned its keep. On hot summer nights, this meal kept folks full without firing up the stove again. It carried the quiet rhythm of old kitchens, simple, clean, and made from what you had. Some would drizzle a little molasses over top or sprinkle sugar if they had extra. Kids slurped it down, while elders remembered the hard times that taught them gratitude. Cornbread and milk supper was proof that even in scarcity, there was dignity, taste, and the kind of peace that only home-cooked food could bring. Frying apples on string lines was the preservation method that turned autumn abundance into winter sustenance without any special equipment or expensive supplies. Apple slices were threaded onto long strings using needles, then hung from rafters, porches, or any warm, dry spot where air could circulate freely around each piece. The process took days or weeks depending on humidity, with families checking constantly for signs of mold or insect damage. Properly dried apples shriveled into leathery rings that could be stored in cloth bags for months without spoiling. Come winter, these dried slices were rehydrated in water or cider and cooked into pies, cobblers, and fried pies that tasted of concentrated sweetness. Children helped with threading, learning patience and satisfaction of preparing for harder times. The strings became decorative as well as practical, hanging in kitchens where their sweet smell mixed with wood smoke. Seasoning a cast iron skillet with nothing but lard and daily use was how every pan in those kitchens got its black, glass-smooth finish, and it took years, not hours. You rubbed the pan with lard or bacon grease after every washing, set it back on the warm stove to dry, and cooked in it again the next morning. The fat polymerized into a hard, slick coating that nothing stuck to, and every meal added another layer. Griswold and Wagner pans from the 1920s were cast thinner and machined smoother than anything made today, and the women who cooked on them built seasoning so deep you could fry an egg and slide it onto a plate without a spatula. People now buy pre-seasoned skillets and wonder why the eggs still stick. The answer is 60 years of daily use that nobody can rush. That pan worked because she used it every day of her life, and when she was gone, the seasoning held more of her than any photograph. Soup beans and fatback were more than supper. They were the week's anchor. The pot would simmer all day on the stove, filling the cabin with that smoky, familiar scent of slow-cooked beans and pork fat. Fatback, a cheap cut from the back of a hog, gave those beans their flavor and a bit of grease for strength. In the Appalachian hills, this was a one-pot wonder that worked hard for families who worked harder. You could ladle it over cornbread, stretch it with onions or greens, and feed everyone until Saturday. There was pride in scraping that pot clean, because it meant you got through another week without wasting a thing. Each scoop was proof that simple food could keep you full and happy without costing much more than time. Some say it tasted like home itself, the kind of comfort no restaurant can serve. Those old soup beans told the story of mountain thrift and heart in every bite. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds before brewing was something the old folks did without explaining why, and if you asked, they just said it tasted better. They were right. The sodium blocks bitter compounds on your tongue, smoothing out the harshness of cheap, over-roasted beans, the only kind most rural families could afford. A quarter teaspoon in the grounds before the water hit was all it took. Alton Brown brought this trick to television decades later and acted like it was a discovery, but women in Appalachian kitchens had been doing it since the early 1900s with the rough ground coffee they bought in bulk from the general store. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You just watched your grandmother add that tiny pinch without measuring, and you tasted the difference in the first cup. The coffee came out rounder, smoother, less like something you had to choke down. Nobody writes it on the bag. You either grew up knowing or you did not. Poke salad greens were one of those dishes that demanded both courage and care. Pokeweed grew wild and fast, but it could turn dangerous if you did not boil it just right. Still, folks learned how to tame it. After boiling and rinsing it several times, they would fry it in bacon grease until tender and smoky. It became a side dish with real backbone, a plate full of green proof that mountain people could make a meal out of almost anything. Every bite carried a hint of the wild earth it came from. Eating poke salad was an act of both survival and defiance. A way to say, we will eat well, even when the cupboard's empty. Served with cornbread or salt pork, it fed families through hard months when gardens were thin. In every community that made it, poke salad greens stood for resilience, bravery, and the genius of hungry folks who refused to go without. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the butter crock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Using potato water as a base for bread dough and soups was a trick born from the simple refusal to waste anything, and the science behind it turned out to be remarkable. That starchy, cloudy liquid left over from boiling potatoes activated yeast faster than plain water, giving homemade bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life. Pour it into a soup pot, and it thickened the broth naturally without needing a roux or a handful of flour stirred in at the end. Depression-era families figured this out by necessity. When you could barely afford the potatoes, you certainly were not pouring their cooking liquid down the drain. Grandmothers kept a pot on the back of the stove for exactly this purpose, ladling the water into jars to cool and use later. Bread made with potato water rose higher and stayed soft a full day longer, and the soups it went into had body and richness that people could not explain but could always taste. The water looked like nothing. It cooked like everything. Fried cabbage and onions was the meal that turned scraps into a feast. You started with whatever you had: a small head of cabbage, a tired onion, and the last spoonful of bacon grease from breakfast. Toss it all into a cast iron skillet and let it fry until the edges browned and the smell filled the house. There was no recipe written down, just instinct and a good ear for the sound of sizzling vegetables. This dinner showed what made hillfolk cooking special: the ability to turn nothing into something worth sitting down for. It was hearty, smoky, and comforting, the kind of dish that could hush an empty stomach and still leave leftovers for breakfast. Paired with a hunk of cornbread or a slice of salt pork, it reminded everyone that flavor did not come from money. It came from patience. Sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that made life feel rich. Smoking meat in the chimney was how mountain families preserved pork, game, and fish, using smoke from fires they were already burning for warmth and cooking. Hooks or racks installed inside chimneys held meat in the rising smoke stream, which dried and flavored the flesh while depositing preservative compounds that prevented spoilage. The technique required careful attention because too much heat cooked the meat while too little failed to preserve it, so families positioned racks at exactly the right height. Different woods produced different flavors, with hickory and apple being prized while pine was avoided for its resinous taste. The process took days or weeks depending on the size of cuts, with someone checking regularly to ensure even smoking. Meat preserved this way lasted through entire winters without refrigeration, providing essential protein. The chimney served double duty, heating the home while preparing food for storage throughout the winter months. Testing oil temperature with a pinch of flour was how every country cook knew the skillet was ready for frying, decades before anyone owned a kitchen thermometer. You dropped a small pinch into the hot grease and watched. If it sank and sat, the oil was too cold. If it sizzled gently and browned slow, you were close. If it hit the surface and immediately danced and popped and turned golden in seconds, the grease was right for chicken, fish, or fritters. Too much smoke meant you had gone too far and needed to pull the pan off the heat. Some cooks used a cube of bread instead. If it browned in 60 seconds, the oil was at around 365 degrees. The knowledge lived in the hands of women who stood over those skillets every evening. And when they stopped cooking, the next generation reached for a thermometer because nobody had taught them what the flour was for. Soup bone and potato hash was what happened when thrift met hunger. After a long week, that old soup bone still had work to do. It went back into the pot for one more boil, drawing out every ounce of flavor left in it. Then you would toss in diced potatoes, onions, maybe a carrot if you were lucky, and fry it all together until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with promise, even when there was not much else to eat. Mountain cooking was about stretching what you had until it could not stretch anymore. This hash tasted smoky, salty, and satisfying. Nothing fancy, just real food made by real hands. Families knew that wasting even a scrap was a sin against hard work. Soup bone and potato hash proved that resourcefulness could taste every bit as good as abundance when cooked with patience and pride. Greasing cast iron with fatback was the secret behind every properly seasoned skillet in rural Appalachian kitchens across the mountain south. Fatback, the thick layer of fat from a hog's back, was rubbed across cast iron cookware while still warm, creating a protective coating that prevented rust and built the non-stick surface that made mountain cooking possible. Women saved every scrap specifically for this purpose, keeping pieces wrapped in cloth near the stove where they stayed soft and ready to use. The process was repeated after every use, building layers of seasoning that turned cheap cast iron into family heirlooms passed through generations. A well-seasoned skillet required no additional oil for frying and released food effortlessly. Children learned this ritual by watching mothers perform it hundreds of times before being trusted with precious cookware. This simple trick transformed basic equipment into tools that lasted lifetimes and cooked food with unmatched quality. Keeping a slice of bread in the brown sugar jar was one of those small kitchen tricks that sounded like nonsense until you tried it. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating on each crystal loses moisture to the air, and the crystals fuse together into a brick you cannot scoop. A slice of plain white bread tucked into the jar released just enough moisture to keep the molasses soft without making anything wet. You replaced the bread every week or so when it went stale, which meant it had done its job. Some families used a damp cloth instead, and others swore by marshmallows, but the bread trick was the cheapest and the most reliable. Nobody explained the science. You just saw your mother drop a heel of bread in the sugar, and 20 years later, you were doing the same thing in your own kitchen without thinking about it. Squirrel stew was born from the woods, not the market. A family that could bring down a squirrel had meat enough for the pot, and that was reason to be thankful. Dressed, chopped, and simmered with onions, potatoes, and carrots, it became a thick, rich stew that smelled like Sunday comfort. No one thought twice about it. Hunting was just part of living. The flavor was earthy and wild, something that no city meal could imitate. Children learned early that nothing caught went to waste, and every bite carried the story of skill and effort. When times were lean, squirrel stew brought warmth, protein, and pride. It was not fancy, but it was honest and filling, the kind of food that fed both body and spirit. Around the table, folks shared not just supper, but the satisfaction of making something good from the land itself. Burying potatoes in ash was one of the oldest cooking methods mountain families used before electric ovens existed in rural Appalachian communities. Fresh potatoes were nestled directly into warm ashes at the edge of a fireplace, covered completely until only coals surrounded them on all sides. The ash acted as insulation, slowly roasting potatoes over several hours until skins turned papery and insides became fluffy and sweet. Families learned exactly how deep to bury them through years of practice passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The technique required no pots, no pans, and no fuel beyond what was already heating the home. Children were sent to check potatoes by poking them with sticks, learning doneness through texture rather than timers. The finished potatoes emerged with subtle smokiness no modern oven could replicate. This method fed families through winters when other cooking options were limited and fuel was precious. Those kitchen tricks kept daily cooking smooth, but some of the old methods reached back centuries, to a time when survival depended on knowing what to do with dried corn and a pile of wood ash. Making lye from hardwood ash to turn corn into hominy was one of the oldest cooking techniques in North America, learned from the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples long before anyone called it nixtamalization. You packed clean ash into a wooden hopper, poured water through it, and collected the alkaline liquid that dripped out the bottom. Dried corn soaked in that lye water for a day or two until the hulls loosened and slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process unlocked niacin that the body cannot absorb from untreated corn. Without it, families who lived on corn developed pellagra. The old cooks did not know the word. They knew that treated corn kept people well and untreated corn did not, and they passed the method along without ever needing a laboratory to prove what their hands already understood. Cabbage and ham hock soup was the kind of dinner that filled both bellies and souls when times were thin and money ran out. The hock, tough and bony but rich with hidden flavor, simmered for hours until the meat fell away and the broth turned smoky. Chopped cabbage leaves, onions, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up the taste that only slow cooking and patience could bring. The kitchen filled with steam and scent, proof that comfort was brewing even without much to spare. It was not fancy, but it fed families for days and cost next to nothing. In mountain kitchens, the secret was never waste. It was making do and making magic from scraps. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was the sound of gratitude itself. Every bowl carried the story of thrift and resilience. A steaming ladle served on a cold evening felt like victory over hardship. Even with little meat, the broth was rich, the cabbage sweet, and the memory lasting. Ham hock soup reminded everyone that love and labor make the best seasoning of all. It was humble food, but it held more comfort than gold ever could. Making buttermilk from scratch with a splash of vinegar and regular milk was one of the oldest substitutions in country baking, and it worked because the acid did exactly what real buttermilk does. It reacted with baking soda to produce the carbon dioxide that made biscuits rise and pancakes turn fluffy. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit for 5 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly, gave you something close enough that no one at the table could tell the difference. Before the 1920s, real buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning cream into butter, and every household that kept a cow had plenty. When families stopped churning, this trick kept the old recipes alive. You poured until the milk looked right, added the vinegar by feel, and moved on. It was just what you did when the recipe called for something you did not have and the nearest store was 20 miles of dirt road away. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story. Make do and make it delicious. Saving bacon grease in tin cans was the foundation of mountain cooking economy, providing fat for frying, seasoning, and flavoring that cost nothing beyond the original bacon. Every time bacon was cooked, the rendered fat was carefully strained through cloth into cans kept beside the stove, building a supply that lasted between hog killings. The grease replaced expensive butter and lard for everyday cooking, adding smoky richness to everything from fried eggs to cornbread. Women knew exactly how much grease remained in their cans and rationed it carefully through lean months. The cans were never washed, building layers of seasoned flavor that improved with age and use. Children learned early that pouring grease down the drain was wasteful foolishness that would earn sharp correction. A full grease can represent security, proof that the family could cook proper meals regardless of cash on hand. This practice continued in mountain kitchens long after it disappeared from cities. Those kitchens went quiet one by one. If any of these took you back, leave a like and tell us which one.